I recently received a letter from an email from a man in Africa, a preacher, who we've interacted for, I don't know, I've known him for probably 2 or 3 years now. And he had a list of questions. I get this a lot. I get a lot of questions, and especially from this guy. But the questions, I went through 10 questions, and every single one of them, it was just soaked in sorrow and mourning and discouragement. And I know the man. I know some of the things he's been through. And I know exactly why he feels that way. He's been rejected by most of his family. He's had a hard time even providing food for his own family. It's been difficult. And one of the questions came to me was, do we have any people that we can look to as examples for how they handled this kind of stuff? Of course, the Bible is full of that, right? But when you're discouraged, you're reaching out. You're trying to find just anybody who can relate. And, of course, I gave him a lot of answers, but the first one I gave was Jesus. You know, Isaiah chapter 53, it's really ironic, really, to think about this, because popular society, if they depict Jesus in any kind of positive light, it's usually that he's just happy-go-lucky, that nothing bothered him. He was just full of joy all the time. I mean, he walked down the street and birds would land on him. He just giving everybody high fives and thumbs ups, and everything's hunky-dory great. And that's not the picture of Jesus. He is called, actually, he was called a drunkard because he would actually spend time with people in parties and stuff. Not that he was a party animal, not that he was a partier, but he was trying to teach people the gospel. And where do you teach people the gospel? You teach them the gospel where you find them. And so he was invited to a lot of people's houses for meals and things like that, and he was criticized for going. But he's not called in any of the Bible verses I've heard. I've never heard him called a man of joy, although I believe he had joy. You know what he's called more than anything is the Son of Man, which is emphasizing his humanity. But one of the nicknames that he had, or one of the ways that you could describe him, is in Isaiah chapter 53, verses 3 and 4. Now, actually, 52, verse 13, all the way through the end of chapter 53, this is one of those premier passages in the Old Testament that talks about Jesus as a prophecy, 720-something years before Jesus was born. This was written about him. But in verses 3 and 4, it says about him, "He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. We hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted." Now, these are descriptions of how he would be seen by other people. And that he's despised, he's rejected. In fact, he says he's a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid as if it were our own faces from him. He was rejected, everyone turned against him, and ultimately that's what happened. The man went from huge popularity, huge crowds. In fact, the Pharisees and the leaders of Israel were afraid. He had so many followers, they were afraid he was going to mount an army against Rome and start a revolution. And of course, he had nothing to do with that. He didn't want anything to do with that. But he had such huge popularity, and then they turned all against him on that day of trial. And they had the opportunity to release him, and they said, "No, crucify him." He had everyone turn against him, almost everyone. And so he's a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. We, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. And it tells the reason in verse 4, "He has borne our griefs, he's carried our sorrows, but we saw him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted." So when he was put on the cross, this was something that was a stumbling block for the Jews, because they thought in their mind, how could a Messiah be put on a cross and crucified? He's been smitten by God. That's how they saw it. And we saw him as someone who was smitten by God, and of course you're only on the cross because you're guilty, right? Well, that's not the case with him. But this is a man of sorrows. And this world that we live in is a world full of sorrow. We all know it. If we wanted to, every single one of us could look at situations and problems and difficulties in our life. And if you're not going through it now, you will be. We know that. And all of us could become easily depressed. And that's the thing about sorrow. This is the problem that this man had. He thought he was the only one going through it. Sorrow does that to you. Oh, I'm the only one. I promise you, there are people that are going through more than you are. That's not something that we can brag about or give us hope. But it should at least make us think that maybe I can learn something through all this. Maybe I can get something from this. And I've said many times that pain is a wonderful teacher, but you can learn the wrong lessons. And a lot of times we don't learn the right lessons from the pain that we're going through. And so either we keep going through the same pains over and over, or we just completely turn our life in the wrong direction because we overreact to the things that are happening to us. And you think about it, you've seen people do both. So let's think about that. We're going to deal with how Jesus dealt with sorrow. And this is the first one actually is John's death. This is John the Baptist in Matthew chapter 14. John the Baptist, Jesus considered him the greatest prophet who had ever lived. The man was the forerunner of Jesus. His message was simply this: Jesus is the Lamb of God. Follow that man over there. And he had huge crowds. Now, before Jesus was ever baptized, he had crowds of people coming to be baptized by him in the Jordan. John actually went out to baptize people, and he baptized masses of people. They came out of the woodwork to come and hear him, and this is a baptism of repentance. Yes, it's related to the forgiveness of their sins, but they had the baptism of forgiveness in that the baptism of repentance, they turned from their sins and they said, I'm going to turn back to God. He was changing their hearts and minds so that, according to Malachi, when John the Baptist would come, he changed their hearts and minds of the fathers and the children back to their fathers so that Jesus wouldn't come and strike the earth with a curse. He had a very important job to fulfill. And he had the entire nation turning around. Now, the Jewish leaders didn't turn, but the Jewish people turned around. They're starting to seek God again because of this one man's influence on the entire society. It was amazing. But John was put in prison one day. Look at Matthew chapter 14. In verse 1, it says, At that time Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Now, he's going to tell us exactly why he was put to death. For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had said to him, It's not lawful for you to have her. And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. So she, having been prompted by her mother, said, Give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter. The king was sorry. Nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given to her. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. His disciples came and took away the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. Now notice next verse. When Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. When Jesus went out and saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. Now notice what's going on. We have this situation. It's a terrible situation with Herod, but the point is that Herod was put to death. And Jesus is mourning over this. This is a man that he loved. And what's the first thing that Jesus did when he heard it? It says, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. Here's a very important idea. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit more as we go through, but look and start in verses 22 and 23. Immediately, Jesus made it. This is actually in verse 14, it says that he healed their sick, he had compassion on them, he saw them, And then this is when he fed the 5,000 also. And then after that, immediately in verse 22, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was alone there. I want you to notice that Jesus here was alone. In verse 13, Jesus departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. He's trying to get away, to get alone, to be alone with his thoughts, with his Father in prayer. In verse 14, though, he saw a multitude coming. So we need to be careful about what we're doing. What Jesus did, however, was he pulled himself away, right? So why would you pull yourself away? He wanted to spend time with his Father in prayer. He did this many times. And in this instance, we can see something that may have been a catalyst for that, the death of John. And he pulls away and he goes off by himself to a deserted place. Now, that is something that we need to be careful to do. Verses 22 and 23. He was interrupted in verse 14, and he didn't just say, you know what, I'm mourning, sorry, I'm not going to help you. He did what he could to help these people, but then he still made time, right? So it's difficult. Jesus was a very busy man. People were coming out. In fact, it says more than one occasion that they didn't even have time to eat. They didn't even have time to rest. They were always busy because people were coming out of the woodwork to learn more about the kingdom, to learn more about the Messiah, to be healed of their diseases and sicknesses. And you can imagine the crowds are all around him constantly. But he made time to spend with his Father. The absolute best thing that you can do is to spend time with the Father in prayer. You know, I'm convinced that although people need advice, they need to be helped, most of us probably know how to get through things. If we don't, our bodies kind of does. Our brain knows how to fix itself to some degree. Sometimes we need a little help with that. I get that. But for the most part, if we will simply get time alone and spend time in prayer with our Father in heaven, and pour our hearts out. You know, I tell you, I have nothing against therapists if they do a good job. But if we would spend more time in prayer, we would have to spend less time on that couch. We pour our hearts out to God. We tell him everything. We tell him how we feel. We tell him what we're thinking, all of our thinking process, and he can help us sort it out. And your brain begins to sort things out and put them in the proper places. And it wants to do that. It wants to do that, but it can't do it unless you are actually giving time for it to process. In our society today, we need this more than anything because we're a lonely, lonely society, but it's very rare that we're actually alone. In one sense of the word. Because, yeah, we may be outside of people, actually having physical contact, but if you're alone, most people, I do this too, I've got to watch it. Most people today, when they're by themselves, what are they doing? They're on their phone. They're on email. They're on the internet. They're doing something. They're playing games. They're all kinds of things. I'm not saying that it's wrong to rest and do relaxation, but we're not talking about relaxation. We're talking about dealing with your problems and your sorrow. If you never allow yourself time to be alone with God, you are not going to heal. It's just not going to work. Even then, it takes time. So go for a walk. Sit in your house and turn off all the games and attachments and how we interconnect with the world around us. All the distractions be taken away. If you want to deal with your sorrow. And a lot of times we don't want to be alone. We don't want it to be quiet. Because then we start hearing it. We start thinking things that we don't like to think about. But I promise you, the reason your brain keeps bringing it up is because you need to process it. You need to go through the pain, the difficulty of letting it sort through and understand what just happened to you or what happened maybe even long ago. John, when he died, Jesus got off by himself alone to spend time with his Father. And you need to create time to process. And, you know, it shouldn't have to be said. It used to be whenever I was younger, I would be out with a push mower. when I was at home, I loved to mow the yard. I hated to be told to do it, but then I got out there and did it. I loved it because it would take me 3 hours. And I spent all that time doing nothing but thinking. I didn't have any distractions. I didn't have no problems with that. I mean, how are you distracted by cutting grass? I wasn't analyzing the grass as I cut it. I was bored, but it forced me to think. And that's invaluable, but we have less and less of that today. It didn't have to be said in the past. Getting out and working with your hands in a garden was a great way. In fact, I've heard people say that's the best therapy you can have. Why? Because you're alone with your thoughts. And it's dangerous to be alone with your thoughts unless you're also alone with your thoughts with God. He can help you process things. Think about that. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13. Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I'm absolutely convinced that he is not talking about the ability to miraculously endure everything. This has nothing to do with Paul's ability to heal people or to speak in tongues or prophesy or any of those things. Had nothing to do with that. Had everything to do with the fact that he spent time alone with God. There's one thing that I look at my life and I regret not doing better job at in my preaching and even my raising my children is the idea of helping people to recognize and love God with everything that they have. Because if you don't have that, you don't have anything. This world is falling apart because no one wants to spend time with God alone. But Jesus did. That's how you deal with it. Look at Lazarus' death in John chapter 11. Lazarus was a close, dear friend of Jesus. And they even commented on the fact that he loved them. He had 2 sisters, and so they were all together, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And Lazarus was about to die. In chapter 11, verse 1, a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So now this is laying it out for the people that don't know who Lazarus is. Therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. When Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, for the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, you need to understand, when Jesus said this is not to death, but for the glory of God, he didn't mean that Lazarus wasn't going to die. He said the end is not going to be death. That's his point, because this is going to be used for the glory of God. His disciples, of course, didn't understand what he was going to say. It says in verse 5, Jesus loved Mary and her sister, loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Okay, so look at verse 11. It says, these things he said, and after that he said to them, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. So now he's telling the disciples, we need to go. It's a day's journey or so to get there. His disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get well. However, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought he was speaking about taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. Then look in, verse 15. And I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. Now look in verse 20. Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary was sitting in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you're the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. When she said these things, she went her way and secretly called Mary, her sister, saying, the teacher has come and is calling for you. As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly and came to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the town, but was in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with him in their house and comforting her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, followed her, saying she's going to the tomb to weep there. Then Mary came where Jesus was and saw him. She fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. And the Jews said, "See how he loved him." Now, there's a lot going on here. And there are a lot of lessons that we can take from this. But notice how Jesus dealt with it. First of all, we see attitude. In chapter 11 and verse 4, he said, "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Now, he understood, he knew what was going to happen. He knew that the man was going to die, and he knew that when he's going to get there, he's going to raise him from the dead. But he saw it as an opportunity for God to be glorified. That is one of the difficult things that we can do in understanding sorrow, is to try to figure out how any of that can be a glory to God. It can. The way you behave and interact can glorify God. The way that you treat one another based on the lessons that you learn from the sorrow can be something that glorifies God. There are a lot of ways to do this. Jesus, although, understood that, though. In verse 15, it says, "I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him." Now, please don't do what other people have done and look at this verse and say, "See, Jesus didn't really care about this guy. He said, I'm glad he's dead." He did say that. But he said, "I'm glad for that he died so that you can understand and you can grow and you can learn more about me," is what he's saying here, that you may believe. And so he knew exactly what was going to happen. You know, sometimes God allows things to happen because there's something that's important that has to happen. I don't understand how God works in every situation. I'm not going to pretend to understand. But I do know that the things that we go through can be all for the glory of God somehow. The attitude is very important that we have toward him or toward the problems that we have. The next one is the idea of acceptance. And this is one that's so, the more I learn, the more I grow, the more I understand that acceptance is so important in life. You've got to accept reality as it is before you can have any impact on it at all. Most of us spend a lot of our time in what my dad used to call affectionately la-la land. That is, we create an environment, we create a reality that is not real so that we can cope with the things of reality. But it's a terrible place to live. It's a terrible place to live because it's not real. We've got to face facts, the things that are. In fact, Jesus said to them plainly, "Lazarus is dead." There are very few times reading about Jesus' words in the Scriptures where he is very plain. And this is one of those few times. He wanted them to know plainly, he is dead. We need to go fix this. We need to go help him. We need to go raise him from the dead. And then we also look at the spiritual consideration. This is 21 through 26. Martha came to him, and Jesus, they're having this interaction, which we just read. And Jesus said, he's going to rise again. Now, Jesus knew that she would misinterpret that to think, well, yeah, in the resurrection, because the Jews were looking forward to that. So he said, he's going to rise again. And she said, well, of course he will in the resurrection. We're going to get to see. In fact, we comfort each other with that, right? 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 tells us that we comfort one another with the idea of Jesus coming back. And he's coming with the souls of the saints that will be reunited with their bodies as they're raised from the dead so that we can go and to be in heaven with Jesus forever. We are comforting one another with those words. That is a wonderful thing we're looking forward to. And so he used that as an opportunity to teach. Now, this is something that really we have to think through a little bit because look at how these people, how do you think that Lazarus' sister is feeling right now? Her brother died. And she confronts Jesus and says, if you would have been here, he wouldn't have died. You know what? If they would have left as soon as they got word that he was sick, he probably would have gotten there before he died. But he intentionally waited because he knew what was going to happen. And he's using this now as an opportunity to teach so that they could learn. That's how important this lesson was. What was the lesson? I am the resurrection and the life. So it wasn't it's not to state that Jesus is saying, well, if you die physically, you're never going to die, because if you follow me, you're never going to die. That's pretty obviously not true. But his point was, in using this as an illustration, he made a very powerful statement about who he is. And if you want to be raised from the dead, to go to the glory of the Father one day, the only way to do that is through Jesus. Now, they got that message. And when they saw him walk out of that tomb, they understood exactly what that meant. He is the only one that could do that. He brought a spiritual side to it. And it's sad that we might get together and have difficult times together, and we might not even think to go to God in prayer. It happens. But it's something that we need to think about, because who else would you want to introduce, even in a group setting, to your pain and sorrow than God, who is the one who can relieve and help? It's a lesson that we need to learn. And we also see John 11:35 that Jesus wept. I don't know why he cried. Honestly, I don't. I have my ideas. It doesn't say why. Jesus knew the man was about to come out of the grave, so why would he be weeping over a man who was about to come back? I mean, literally, within minutes, he's going to see him again. I think it probably related more to the fact that he saw other people weeping and crying, and they didn't get it. They didn't know what was going to happen. It could be that. Johnny Ramsey said, well, he knew that Lazarus was in the bosom of Abraham in paradise, and he was weeping because he had to bring him back from there. It's a possibility. I have no idea. But I do know one thing. When you're around other people who are sorrowing, you also sorrow, don't you? If you care about those people. When Paul said that we weep with those who weep, we mourn with those who mourn, we rejoice with those people who rejoice, it wasn't a command that whenever I see you crying, I have to create crocodile tears and cry with you. That's not what he meant. We should be so close to one another that when you hurt, I hurt. And when I hurt, you hurt. It should be that we are together. Now, that doesn't mean that we go around with our emotions on our sleeves and have everyone crying all the time. That's not the point. But there are times in life when you need to sit with someone in their sorrow and be with them, because they need that interaction. They need to see that it affects you. That's a challenge. And Jesus definitely dealt with things in the right way. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. One of the things that I actually didn't bring out that I thought of after I put this together was that Jesus not only spent time by himself, but he also spent time with people. And we'll see that in the next section. Chapter 4 and verse 13 says, "But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope." The word for Jesus weeping is not a word, in that century, and actually even now, as I understand it in some places, they would actually hire people to come in and be professional mourners. They would come in and weep and wail and carry on and throw fits and all kinds of stuff. And the more you want to say that this person was impressive to the community, and the more you want to brag on this person, the more mourners you would actually have. And the rich would have many people mourning, and they would be walking down the streets carrying the coffin, and they would have lines of people just mourning and wailing and all carrying on and crawling on their knees. And you've probably seen people that way. That's not the word that describes what Jesus did. It just means he shed some tears. As Christians, we have no right to mourn like the rest of the world. We don't. Because if we believe that we're going to see that person again, we can mourn. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing more wrong with sorrow, having sorrow. But it might indicate that we have a lack of faith if we go to an excess, because we may not believe that God's actually coming back. Or we may not believe that God will resolve the issue that we're going through, the problem that we're going through. So we need to be careful not to mourn as the rest of the world, as if we have no hope. And that's his point. Remember that with God, you have hope. God is the ultimate judge, and we will see those people again. And if they are faithful and we are faithful, we get to spend eternity in heaven. That's something that we can take comfort in. It doesn't answer all the questions. There are still some difficulties, but it is important that we recognize that. There is a point in which we can say, maybe I'm going too far with this. And that is if we have no hope. And any situation that we're in, that especially if we're dealing with people who are still alive, and let's put it that way, because all of us have difficulties and problems and sorrows with people even that are living. There's always hope, because we serve a God who can do anything and who is always willing and working with people, trying to bring them back. I believe that with all my heart. Lazarus' death teaches us a lot of stuff, a lot of things about Jesus and how he dealt with it. Matthew chapter 26 is how he dealt with his own death. And this is important that we recognize too. This is, Jesus knew he was going to mourn, and it kind of dawned on me just before I got up here. Jesus knew he was going to die his whole life. I don't know when he learned it, but he knew he was going to die. And he knew that when he was actually in Galilee, it says that he turned his face toward Jerusalem. He was determined to go to Jerusalem because he knew that his death appointment was coming soon. But he didn't sit around and mourn about it the whole time. He didn't spend his 3.5 years of ministry mourning, oh, I can't believe I'm going to have to die. He probably walked by many people writhing in agony on a cross, because the Romans love to crucify people. He didn't look at that person and go, man, that's going to be me. I can't believe that, and just mourn and weep the whole 3 years. Jesus said, you worry about today. It has its troubles of its own. And he gave an example of that, because you see the mourning that he went through in chapter 26, where it says that it was like sweat coming out, like blood coming out of his sweat. And look in verse 36. Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, sit here while I go and pray over there. And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. He said to them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. He went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, oh, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. He came to his disciples and found them sleeping and said to Peter, what? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? And watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, a second time he went away and prayed, saying, oh, my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done. He came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them, went away again, and prayed the third time, saying the same words. And he came to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. So look at the fact is he is mourning. This is something that is distressful for him. And in fact, it's in verse 37, he was in deep distress over about what he's going to endure. He knew what was coming, but he refused to worry about it until it was there, the day of it. We also see that the word agony means a violent struggle. He was in agony because he was struggling. What was he struggling with? You can see from his prayer what he was struggling with. He said, let this cup pass from me. If there's any way that you can work it out, that I don't have to go through this. But then he ended by saying, but not my will, yours be done. He didn't say that out of doubt. He said it as an acceptance and a recognition that I'm going to go through pain and trouble and sorrow. And he decided, it took him 3 different times going back. The last one, he came back and said, I'm ready. Let's go. You're going to find that you face a lot of trials and trouble, and you might know it's coming. It might be because of your faith in Jesus. Spend time in prayer and in the agony of self-defeat so that you can overcome you and submit to the Father. There's no greater place of Jesus' submission to the Father than this here. In fact, in In Luke 22 and verse 44, he was in agony, and it says his sweat became like drops of blood. And some scholars and some scientists believe that there is supposedly is a case where you can be so intensely concerned and stressed that the capillaries in your forehead may burst, and you may actually literally bleed. I don't know if he meant that or if it was just he was in agony, he was just sweating so much because of this fight that's going on in the inside. But I don't know if I've ever fought so hard against things that I wanted to do versus what God wanted that I broke out in a sweat. Have you? You know, the book of Hebrews says you haven't resisted to bloodshed. I haven't even resisted to sweating yet. But why not? Jesus dealt with it by facing it and accepting it and embracing it. That's the only way through it. And the acceptance of that is not just, I accept that these guys are going to murder me. The acceptance is, I realize that I'm going to go through this and these guys are going to murder me and treat me and torture me, and that my Father wants it to happen. That's what he had to accept and embrace. And when you recognize then that it's part of God's plan, you can endure it and go through it. In fact, the idea here is that with every prayer, the intensity is growing. That's kind of what's being depicted. 3 times, the intensity growing each time. And so now you have this man of agony going through about what's about to happen, which will be agony. And it's no wonder. No one wants to go through pain, but the idea of Jesus going through, this is not cowardice. This is a man who has seen, as I said before, has probably walked by many people who were hanging on a cross, dying of asphyxiation in agony. He knew exactly what was about to happen to him, that he would be beaten and all kinds of things and spit on and all the different things. In fact, look in verse 7, this speaking of Jesus, it says, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, was heard because of his godly fear. Now this is saying that he was heard. Yeah, God heard him. And God saved him, but not before he went through it all. Psalm 22 is the exact same thing. It's all this pain and suffering and sorrow that he had to go through, and we have the audacity sometimes to go, God, why do you make me go through this stuff? Why do you make things hard for me in my life? Why is it I have difficulties and no one else does? Why is it so many things? You know what? It's not 6 hours on a cross. Even if it were, you put your faith in God to save you, and even that means you're going to have to maybe even go through it. You know, there's a concept in the book of Revelation that says people, 144,000 were sealed, protected by God. But sealed did not mean that they were actually kept from tribulation. God will allow you to go through all kinds of pain and sorrow and suffering in this life. And the only thing that you should worry about is what happens on the other side of this, because it's short-lived. And you need to learn the right lessons. And you can't learn the lessons unless you learn how to deal with sorrow effectively. And that is, you're spending time with God, trying to make sense of it all, pouring your heart out to Him, and He will help you through. That's what we have. So mourning properly, here's something we need to recognize. Sorrow does not indicate spiritual lack. Just because you're hurting doesn't mean you're not spiritual. Doesn't mean you're sinful. Jesus hurt as well. We also need to remember that sorrow is limited. Sometimes we can draw it out, but it is limited. Sometimes I've known people that it's like every year they want to celebrate all the terrible atrocities. Almost every day of their calendar, there's some other atrocity that they're remembering. Why would we do that to ourselves? We need to move forward. Sorrow is limited. It's supposed to be limited. We need to choose to move forward. We need to choose to mourn in healthy ways, and we need to choose to draw closer to God. And if you're going through sorrow and you're not drawing closer to God, you're missing the point. You're missing what you can get out of it, because the best thing that you can get from any sorrow is a closer walk with God. That is the best thing that can happen. And that's not saying it's a terrible thing. It's not saying it's like peanuts. If the only thing you get out of your sorrow is a closer walk with God, you have everything. That's the only thing that matters. So use your sorrow to your advantage and do what God intended with it, and that is grow closer to Him. And don't pull away and block God out of your life because you're hurting. He wants you to come to Him. And sometimes that sorrow is just the right lesson we need if we'll learn from it. Learn the right lesson. Jesus dealt with sorrow. I want to encourage you to look into that a little bit more. There's a lot more that could be said about that. But if you have need today, I hope that you'll let us know. If you need prayers of the church, there's no shame in needing help. We all need help. If you want to make that public, let us know. If you want to talk in private, please just talk to me or any of the other people around here. And if you're not a Christian, you need to become a Christian today by being baptized in the name of Jesus for the remission of your sins. We're here to help you with that too. If there's anything we can do to help, please come as we stand and sing.